How did a wealthy, quiet Saudi man transform from a privileged outsider into the architect of a global terror network and create a network that would change the world? What drove Osama bin Laden to create al-Qaeda? Ideology, ambition, or something far more personal? It began with a paradox. A young millionaire, born into one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia, slowly distancing himself from the comfort he inherited. He traded marble hallways for muddy trenches, traded a world of business influence for an obscure camp near the Afghan mountains. To the people who knew him, it didn't make sense. And yet, somewhere between these two worlds, Osama bin Laden made the decision that would reshape global history. Decades later, the question lingers like a shadow. How did someone raised in privilege become the founder of al-Qaeda? And why did he believe the world needed such an organization in the first place? To understand that, we have to step backward, not into ideology, but into a feeling. A quiet, almost invisible emotion that would follow him from childhood into adulthood, the pull towards significance. Bin Laden was born in 1957, the 17th son of a billionaire construction tycoon. His early life mixed religious conservatism with immense wealth, but within that combination was a contradiction. He lived in luxury, yet he was taught that simplicity, sacrifice, and devotion were the path to righteousness. This tension between privilege and piety shaped his inner world long before politics did. As he grew older, he became drawn to religious teachers who emphasized duty, purity, and confrontation with foreign influence. Their message wasn't yet violent, but it planted a question in him. What does a true believer owe the world? Then came 1979. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Across the Muslim world, this was seen not merely as geopolitics, but as a symbolic attack on a vulnerable region. Young men traveled there out of solidarity, adventure, or a sense of destiny. Bin Laden was one of them. Quiet, uncharismatic, but deeply impressionable. In Afghanistan, he wasn't a hero. Not yet. He funded projects, brought equipment, arranged supply lines. He built roads and tunnels, using his construction background as a kind of wartime service. But on the mountainsides, among the fighters, he found something he had never experienced at home: a sense of being essential. And that feeling, being needed, was more powerful than ideology. When the Soviet Union eventually withdrew, the foreign volunteers celebrated. They believed they had defeated a superpower. They believed history had just proven something extraordinary about themselves. But when the war ended, everything dissolved. The fighters returned home to governments that feared them, societies that didn't want them, and families that struggled to understand what they'd become. Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia expecting admiration. Instead, he found indifference. The war he saw as a spiritual triumph was seen by his own country as a geopolitical inconvenience. It was in that disappointment, that anticlimax, that the seeds of al-Qaeda began to form. He had tasted purpose, and now it was gone. In 1988, he created a small network. It wasn't a military group, not yet. It was more like a registry, a list of foreign fighters, trainers, logisticians, and contacts, a way to keep the brotherhood alive. But the brotherhood had begun to mutate. Many veterans interpreted the Soviet withdrawal not as a tactical decision, but as a divine sign. If a ragtag band of believers could push out a global superpower, they reasoned, then God had chosen them for something greater. That idea electrified them, and it pushed bin Laden into new territory, not just supporting fighters, but imagining himself as their leader. As the 1990s began, the world changed again. Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States and its allies deployed troops to Saudi Arabia. For most of the Saudi population, it was a pragmatic decision. For bin Laden, it was something else entirely. Foreign soldiers on what he saw as sacred soil felt like a violation, a humiliation, a reminder of the region's fragility. And suddenly, the mission he had been searching for crystallized in his mind. He believed the Muslim world was under threat, not from invaders alone, but from moral decline, political corruption, and foreign dependency. He convinced himself that he could provide the solution. But there was a deeper layer, a psychological one. The war had given him a narrative in which he mattered. The presence of US troops gave him an antagonist, and the veterans he had organized gave him an audience. Piece by piece, al-Qaeda emerged, not as a single blueprint, but as an answer to a series of personal and historical frustrations. There is a forgotten irony here. Bin Laden saw himself as a defender, someone preventing chaos. But in trying to protect the world he imagined, he created the world he feared. The attacks carried out in al-Qaeda's name triggered wars, occupations, mass surveillance, refugee crises, and geopolitical shockwaves that still shape global politics today. His attempt to restore dignity instead destabilized entire regions. His effort to resist foreign influence led to more of it. His desire to unify believers fractured communities further. And the organization built to fill his sense of purpose ended up consuming it. If you zoom out far enough, the origins of al-Qaeda are not just political or religious. They echo something universal, a human tendency to search for meaning in moments of uncertainty. When identity feels fragile, people grab on to simple explanations. When a mission ends, they search for a bigger one. And when fear becomes intertwined with conviction, even ordinary decisions can drift into extremity. Movements like al-Qaeda don't appear overnight. They form when history opens a vacuum and someone decides they are meant to fill it. That someone becomes a symbol. And symbols, once created, take on lives of their own. Years before the world knew his name, a young man walked into the mountains of Afghanistan seeking purpose. The irony is that he never left those mountains. He rebuilt them everywhere he went, carrying the war inside him long after it was over. The camps he built, the networks he formed, the ideas he embraced, all of them were shadows of a battlefield that had ended, but never ended for him. In the end, the paradox remains. Osama bin Laden founded al-Qaeda not simply out of ideology or hatred, but out of a search for meaning that spiraled into destruction. The void he tried to fill became the void he left behind. A quiet man chasing significance and reshaping the world through the consequences of that search. But there is one more layer, the part rarely discussed, the part that makes the story unsettling. Bin Laden did not expect al-Qaeda to become what it became. In his mind, it would be a vanguard, a small group that would awaken the wider Muslim world. But awakening does not always mean clarity. Sometimes it means fracture. As the 1990s unfolded, the organization grew in ways he couldn't fully control. New recruits arrived shaped by different grievances, different traumas, different interpretations of struggle. The veterans from Afghanistan believed in discipline. The younger fighters believed in spectacle. Ideology became a mosaic, a patchwork of anger and belief moving faster than the man who started it. He tried to centralize command, but the network resisted it. He tried to define a single enemy, but his followers saw enemies everywhere. And so al-Qaeda became something he never intended, a banner rather than an organization, a concept rather than a hierarchy. This is the part of the story that slips through most analyses, the loss of control. Al-Qaeda's early attacks did not bring unity, they brought fragmentation. Some groups used the name for local agendas, others used it for global ones. Each new branch carried its own history, its own bitterness, its own version of justification. Bin Laden had set out to build a structure of meaning. Instead, he built a storm he could not contain. By the late 1990s, he believed he was moving toward a final confrontation. In reality, he was moving toward irrelevance, even inside his own creation. The world knew his name, but the forces he unleashed were no longer waiting for his instruction. This is the contradiction that lingers. He wanted to defend the Ummah, but the networks he inspired inflicted some of their deepest wounds on the very communities they claimed to protect. Entire cities in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia would eventually feel the impact of groups acting in al-Qaeda's name, each splinter acting out its own version of vengeance. And all of it traced back to a man searching for clarity in a world he felt was slipping away. Years later, hiding in a quiet house in Abbottabad, bin Laden watched the movement he started evolve without him. He wrote letters urging restraint, warning younger fighters not to alienate the very Muslims they claimed to represent. But his words carried far less weight than they once had. The symbol he created had grown larger than the man. As time passed, something subtle happened. The world shifted. Governments responded with alliances and surveillance networks. New extremist groups arose, each claiming a purer vision than the last. And the cycle of reaction and counter-reaction became the architecture of an entire era. All of this began with decisions made in the mountains decades earlier. Decisions grounded not in strategy, but in emotion, identity, belonging, purpose, fear. When we trace the origin of al-Qaeda, we do not simply find geopolitics or religion. We find a human story, a story about what happens when a person mistakes certainty for destiny, and when a moment of purpose becomes a lifelong mission. And this is where the story loops back to the beginning. A young man left behind a life of luxury, convinced he needed to trade comfort for meaning. He found that meaning on a battlefield that felt righteous and pure. And once he tasted that sense of purpose, he never let it go. Even when the war ended, even when the world around him changed, even when the consequences spiraled beyond anything he imagined. The irony is that the purpose he built his identity on became the thing that consumed him. He tried to fill a void. Instead, he carved a deeper one. And in the end, the story of why Osama bin Laden founded al-Qaeda is not simply a story about ideology, or politics, or even violence. It is a story about the danger of searching for significance in absolutes, about what happens when a single narrative becomes more real than the world itself, about the quiet places in the human mind where conviction turns into something unrecognizable. A young man walked into a war seeking meaning, and whether he understood it or not, he spent the rest of his life trying and failing to step out of its shadow. That is the legacy he left behind, a movement born from a search for purpose, a world reshaped by the consequences, and a void that still echoes long after the man is gone.